Clark, and you know, you mentioned I retired, but actually I do have a job. I'm the dean of the Josef Korbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver. And people always say, well, what's that like? I mean, what is it like to deal with faculty members? And I said, well, I've had experience with North Koreans. Faculty members do not have nuclear weapons either, so that's always something I appreciate about faculty members. At least nuclear weapons that they wouldn't want to use against us. But let me just say, what a pleasure it is to be back in the state of Washington, the real Washington. This is really a state that the other 49 states truly admire. First of all, it has a surplus with the Republic of Korea. Consul General Moon, you have to get working on that, but I think this is the only state that has a surplus with the Republic of Korea. But this state does so many things well, and I think this example, first of all, the one thing it does well is higher education, because the University of Washington is truly one of the great institutions of this country. I know the football team has been a little down this year, but let's put aside the football team and look at all the other extraordinary things. I went to a little college in Maine on the other side of the United States, and I majored in economics, and my two favorite economic professors were trained right here at the University of Washington, so I've known about this place for a while, actually. I think the University of Washington is very correct in looking to see what kind of concentrations there should be, what sort of focuses there should be. I think this Korean Peninsula Forum is a particularly excellent idea for this university to incubate, to cultivate, and ultimately to make this forum thrive. It is not just the fact of the trade numbers with Korea, it's the fact that this Pacific Northwest is joined by a very large ocean to Korea. And so many times in Korea, you know, people would be surprised at the great interest of the United States in Korea. And it's not just historical, it's not just our peoples, it's really a shared values and the importance, really, that the United States attaches to this great relationship. So I'm very pleased to be here as part of this Korean Peninsula Forum. I think I've been asked to talk tonight about regional dynamics in Northeast Asia. Regional dynamics, you know you're in a university when the talk starts with the second word is already dynamics. But also the future of the Republic of Korea-U.S. relationship. I can assure you there is no relationship in the world that is more important than the U.S.-ROK relationship. And I say that really with a full understanding that the United States has many important relationships around the world. But in Korea, we went from a relationship that was almost entirely bilateral, and there are still many bilateral elements to the U.S.-ROK relationship. Then the relationship became regional, and I'll get back to the subject of North Korea, indeed to the subject of the six-party talks. And to be sure, the regional dimensions of the U.S.-ROK relationship are critical. But I think the third element, and this is an element that I think American presidents in particular have noticed in recent years, South Korea, the Republic of Korea, is a country that does not just see itself in terms of its peninsula, in terms of its region, but rather sees itself as having interests globally. Now, I know that President Lee Myung-bak tried to talk to his fellow Korean citizens about this, and it didn't take too well necessarily. There are many Koreans, it's a little too much. We're just trying to struggle through this week, and we really don't need to be thinking about the globe. And yet, when you look at the fact that Korea has embraced international trade, as many countries have not, you can go anywhere in the world and you will see these iconic Korean name brands. all over the world. And they are also part of a broader Korean presence. There is no country apart from the United States that has a greater percentage of its population in many different countries as missionaries than Korea. Korea has one of the highest missionary populations. So, you know, if you're in a country in Africa, chances are you're going to find a Korean missionary. And then I think most gratifying, because Mr. Park made the comment about the Peace Corps, something in my CV that I am very proud of. And Mr. Park, I think you're proud of your daughter for the same reason, Korea has actually formed a volunteer corps to do precisely this, and to try, if not to export the model, and I'll get back to that theme because I think we all have to be a little careful about exporting our stuff to other countries in terms of, you know, telling other countries to be like us. But in a way, showing our example and showing that what we've been able to accomplish and why other countries might want to look at that. You know, I will mention one experience from the Peace Corps. You know, you put a retired Peace Corps volunteer in front of an audience and I can talk to you for hours about the Peace Corps. I'll tell you one story. In fact, it's really one that I think guided me through much of my foreign service career, and that was my job in the Peace Corps. I supervised little village banks, and I went around making sure the money was properly accounted for, and, you know, and add up ledgers and you know, make sure that everything was going okay. And one of these banks, the board of directors had clearly, I mean, the money was accounted for, but there were far too many loans in the hands of far too many people, far too few people. That is, board of directors consisting of 10% or 5% of the credit union membership, the village bank membership, and something like 50% of the loans. So I thought this was outrageous, this has got to change. I did my homework, I figured out who I could bring as a competing board of directors. I raised it in the general membership. Everyone thanked me. I mean, person after person stood up and said, "Thank you very much for pointing this out." The board of directors was furious at me. They said, "You're ruining the credit union," and yet all these people were just so grateful. I said, "Okay, I've done the right thing here." And then I had named a new board of directors who I thought would do a much better job of running the credit union than this old board of directors that had taken far too much loan money. And in rural Cameroon, you didn't have secret ballots or mail-in ballots or electronic balloting. What you had was you put the old board in this part of the meadow, this large field, and you put the new board over here, and people just kind of fall in behind them, and then you'd count heads. Well, it was about 90% voted for the old board. And so this was in spite of the fact that everyone was coming up to me and saying, "Thank you very much, thank you for all you've done, this is great, you pointed this out, these people need to be, you know, well, in my words, with their thoughts, they need to be, you know, made accountable for the fact that they've taken too much loan money, so thank you very much." Very grateful, and then they vote for the old guys. And so I remember just walking out of that meeting just staggered. But the first thing I learned from it is don't choose someone else's leaders. They're going to have to do that for themselves. And so I think the United States, we need to do a better job of working with other countries, but respecting the decisions that other countries made. To be sure, we need to set examples, set positive examples, but they've got to do things. And so I think as we've managed the ROK relationship, it took us a little while to figure that out, but we have definitely figured that out now. And so I think the reason I am so optimistic about the next 60 years of this U.S.-Korean relationship is that it is based on mutual respect. We don't tell Koreans what to do, they don't tell us what to do, and I think we have a tremendous relationship. And so I think that is the kind of example that I think will serve us well, and perhaps serve Korea very well as it also makes its way in the world. So I think the U.S.-ROK relationship is based on this mutual respect, based on shared values, based on really cultural ties that one can certainly see in this room as well, and based on a common understanding of of what some of the problems are in the world. So I think what the United States has tried to do in recent years, and I think President Obama was correct to try to do this, was to say that we need to, the United States really needs to understand that we have these very special relationships in Asia, and isn't it about time that we allow this Asia perspective, which is so well understood here in the state of Washington, isn't it about time we allow this Asia perspective to achieve the status vis-a-vis our perspective looking the other way, looking over the Atlantic Ocean? And so President Obama, just 3 years ago, stood up in front of in the APEC meeting in Honolulu, and he announced the pivot. And he announced that the United States would begin a process of shifting its attention to Asia. And I thought that was, for those of us who worked very hard on the issues in East Asia, I mean, I made many, many trips to China, I made many trips to Korea, I made, something like 6 or 7 trips to Bangkok, to the Philippines. I spent a lot of time, so it was a little surprising to me that we were saying we had ignored Asia. But nonetheless, if we were going to spend more time, I certainly supported that. But I think when you do things like that, you do create some unintended consequences. And I think these unintended consequences have had a real impact in how the United States can manage its foreign policy currently and in the years ahead. The first unintended consequence was, of course, in the Middle East, where there was a sense in the Middle East the United States somehow doesn't care anymore, and that we're not strong, we don't have a strong enough presence there. And I think the consequence of that is that there has been a kind of free-for-all going on in the Middle East. And sadly, it's degenerate as the Arab Spring kind of took its toll on the reputations of these nations, these Arab nation states. I mean, there's an open question whether Arab nation states are going to be around with us in the future, because many of them are under assault right now. So what has happened is the publics there, the populations there have kind of changed their focus or their loyalties to something that they're more trusting of, and what you're seeing is a growth in sectarianism. So you see more and more people in the Middle East believing that they're Shia first and a national of some state second, or Sunni first and a national of some state second. In fact, the whole Arab Middle East nation-state structure is now denounced in many quarters as a kind of colonialist venture of the British and the French, but also the U.S. now is held to blame there. So things have gone very badly in the Middle East in recent years. And I'm not saying it's all because of President Obama's pivot, but certainly there's a sense that the U.S. doesn't care. And now the United States is going to have to spend a lot more time there than we planned to before. But I think the second, and maybe most a longer-term problem, because I think eventually this issue of the ISIS crisis is going to get resolved. There will be an effort to there will be a military and eventually a political effort to do something about this. We worry about Syria, but eventually that will also be addressed. But I think the longer-term unintended consequence has been in our relationship with China. And I think from the Korean perspective, a good U.S. relationship with China is critical to Korea's future, just as a good Korean relationship with China is critical to U.S. interests in the Pacific. So I think the unintended consequence in Asia was that we were somehow getting out of the confrontative mode in the Middle East and bringing to bear this kind of sense of confrontation in East Asia. And I think the consequence has been that the U.S.-China relationship has suffered from the pivot. It should have been improved by the pivot. Instead, it seems to have suffered. Mind you, I think a lot of what has gone wrong in recent years in the U.S. relationship with China is not what the U.S. has been doing, but rather what has been going on internally in China. And I think that is something we all ought to pay a lot of attention to. There is, just as in the Middle East, as you see these nation states kind of under siege and people reverting to other forms of loyalty, often sectarian or even tribal loyalty, we're seeing in Asia, in some countries, not all, but some countries, we're seeing an increasing sort of frustration with government, with the consequence that people are becoming somehow more nationalistic in their outlook. They somehow see the government as not somehow performing and not protecting the national interests. And we see nationalism on the rise in the region. We certainly see it to some extent in Japan, and I'll get back to that a little later. We see a little of it in Korea, but we see a lot of it in China. And I think what is happening in China today is we have a government that increasingly feels it is being rejected by its people, and the people therefore, or the government therefore, feels it has to be much more strong-minded about protecting the national interests and showing that it can manage these national interests. After all, China went through what they call a century of shame, and somehow, in the view of many people in China, this century of shame somehow continues to exist, albeit in different forms. So we see in China a kind of growing nationalism. We certainly see it in their relations with Southeast Asian states. A few years ago, it was said that, as recently as 10 years ago, it was said that China is China has done a far better job in managing the diplomacy of its region. There are many stories in the U.S. press about how, in contrast to American leaders who would come to country X and spend 12 hours there and then race off to countries Y and Z, Chinese officials would come to these countries and spend 3 days there and learn the folk dances and otherwise seem very interested in doing more listening tours, while America was seen more in a sort of broadcast mode. But if you look at how China has managed some of these relationships in the most recent years, it has gone very badly. They have essentially gotten into a situation with the Vietnamese. They know the Vietnamese better than anybody, and yet when you look at the China-Vietnam relationship, it's turned a lot worse in these recent years. Of course, the Chinese have a little difficulty being introspective enough, and so they consequently blame the United States. They say, you Americans, you caused this problem with Vietnam. Well, I must say, when I was just 10 years ago, or 8 years ago, when I was dealing with the Vietnamese, they would talk about their frustrations with the Chinese, but they would never ask the U.S. to do something about them. They would understand, look, this is our problem, we need to deal with it. For example, China would tell an American oil company, if you're going to work with us, you cannot work with the Vietnamese. The Vietnamese would hear this. There are very few secrets of that kind. And so the Vietnamese would brief us on this, and I'd say, you want me to say something in Beijing? Please don't. We just want you to be aware of this. And so now, I think that situation has changed, and the Vietnamese want to see us much more engaged in somehow defending them against the Chinese. They want us to take very tough public positions. But every time we take a tough public position, as Secretary Clinton did a few years ago, the Chinese then blame the Americans for having a problem with Vietnam. Similarly, their relations with the Philippines have deteriorated mightily in the last couple of years. I was in Manila this past year, and to hear the Filipinos refer to the Chinese as bullies is quite a new phenomenon, to say that openly to Americans. The Filipinos would never want the U.S. and China to be at cross purposes over them. They didn't want that in the past, and now they're much more open about it. And there too, their own nationalism, where the Filipinos are referring to this part of the South China Sea as the West Philippine Sea, is one that certainly the Chinese have noticed. So in the Chinese efforts to kind of codify their claim to the South China Sea and turn it into a southern Chinese lake, they have caused a lot of problems with in their relationships with those countries. And this is not good news for the United States. For those people who believe that China's worsening relations with its neighbors is somehow good news for the U.S., it is not. And so the United States, I think, needs to tread very carefully on this. Obviously, this is a dance the Chinese started themselves, and they're going to have to figure out how to get out of this. We can't be mediating between China and Vietnam, or China and Malaysia, or China and the Philippines. But certainly, the Chinese need to understand that these relationships are not helpful. I think Xi Jinping has tried to say at various times that Asia is big enough for the United States and China. There's no lack of room in East Asia for the United States. And yet, when you look at some of the Chinese military efforts, when you look at the ramping up of some U.S. military presence in the region, one does get the sense that, at least viewed from our security forces perspective, we don't see that somehow there's room for both of us. So I think this China relationship for the United States is very complex, and we need to pay a lot of attention to it. But I think one of the key things that for China needs to be addressed is right on the Korean Peninsula. It is one thing to have maritime disputes with your neighbors. Almost everyone has them, except maybe the Czech Republic or Hungary or something. But everyone else has maritime disputes. But the problem, I think, for China is not so much its maritime disputes with its Southeast Asian states. It's continued support, or at least tacit support, for the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, otherwise known as North Korea. As long as China continues, in effect, to provide a tacit support to North Korea, that becomes a kind of civilizational divide between China and the rest of the world. And so I think China really needs to rethink this. And when you talk to many Chinese, they are prepared. They are beginning to rethink this. But I think their government in Beijing is very much in a kind of old think mode. For example, if you read a U.S. newspaper about China and North Korea, you would think the Chinese are worried about North Korea's collapse because they're worried about North Korean refugees flooding into China. A somewhat more sophisticated version of that, since after all there are 1.4 billion Chinese and 22 million North Koreans at last count, doesn't seem like that serious a problem. So a somewhat more sophisticated view of that would be, if you look at northeast China, there's quite a complex ethnic mishmash of various peoples, and certainly a large influx of Koreans could somehow affect this and affect attitudes and affect local tensions or cause local tensions in northeast China. I submit to you, however, this is not about North Korean refugees. I think the real reason for China is they look at things in very much of a kind of zero-sum game. And they see if North Korea were to go down, that means the Republic of Korea is the successor state. The Republic of Korea is a U.S. ally. That means that this would be a victory for America and a defeat for China. And they're not prepared to stand that, to put up with that. So, in addition, when you go beyond this, the Chinese also, if you look at the internal churn within China about whether they have a governmental system that is a so-called communist system at this point. I say so-called because it's hard to say what people mean by it. There's a whole question within China of whether this political system can manage China's challenges in the future. Certainly Xi Jinping has tried to thread this needle by saying that he wants to clean up the system and leave the contours of it very much in place, that is not change structures of it, but clean it up. So you see a great interest in going after corruption, at the same time trying to leave the accoutrements of the state pretty much as they are. I think that I understand that course of action. I think it's pretty much doomed to failure, because I think the basic Chinese system as it is set up now has corruption as an organic part of it. And I think for China to deal with corruption is ultimately to deal with systemic reform. But clearly Xi Jinping is not interested in systemic reform, at least at this point. So he's trying to hold on to the system, but clearly this is what animates him, trying to hold on to the system. So if you have a sort of Marxist, I say sort of, a Marxist-Leninist system in North Korea, with a historical connection to China and historical connection to many of China's senior communist leaders, and if that goes down, how does that affect the domestic debate within China between those who want to reform the structure fundamentally and those who just want to tinker with the edges and deal with the corruption issues? I would say there are many people in China who worry that a collapse of North Korea would have effects on China's domestic politics, and therefore China cannot put up with a collapse of North Korea. So I think these are issues that countries like the ROK and the US need to deal with, because one thing is very clear to me: it is not just for China's future that North Korea needs to go away. It is for the future of 22 million North Koreans that North Korea needs to go away. This is a system that is right now a sort of blot on the face of our civilization in the world today. I very much welcomed the Australian Supreme Court Justice Michael Kirby's report. I very much welcome the open airing of North Korea's human rights record. People said, well, when you were doing the nuclear talks, you didn't seem to want to talk about that publicly, and they are absolutely right, because it was hard enough to get the North Koreans to do anything on nuclear talks and say, oh, by the way, I'd now like to talk about your human rights record in addition to your Yongbyon reactor. So, no, I focused on the nuclear issue, but I think it is quite, as someone who's now not doing that, I think it's quite fair to make the point that North Korea's systematized abuse of people, which has been so documented, including by someone in this room tonight, Blaine Harden, who wrote a book about this subject. I think it's very important that this be aired. And yet the Chinese worry about this. And in fact, when they looked at the Michael Kirby report, they sort of saw themselves as somehow unindicted co-conspirators in this drama. So again, I think it speaks to a need for the ROK and the US to somehow do a much better job in building our relationships with China. It is not easy, because there's so many things we disagree with the Chinese, starting with their system, starting with their behavior to some of their neighbors, especially in Southeast Asia. I think it is going to be a big challenge, but I think we need to address this if we're going to deal with this issue of North Korea. Already the Chinese people clearly would like to see a change in how China manages its North Korean relationship. And I think our task is to try to make us appear less threatening to the Chinese government in this regard. I think there are a couple of things we could do in this regard. First of all, whenever I hear an American say, well, why are the South Koreans talking to the Chinese? Does this mean they're trying to create the balancing role, as Noam Young very unfortunately and ineffectively described one day? No, I think it is very much in the United States' interest that South Korea have a good relationship with China, and that China begins to get used to the ROK as the neighbor and the successor state in the Korean Peninsula. I, for one, very much welcomed Park Geun-hye's visit to China. I very much welcomed Xi Jinping's visit to Seoul. I think that is a relationship that the United States needs to encourage. I'd like to see us continue to have the very good cooperation that we have with the ROK. I think anytime you have two close allies, as the U.S. and the ROK are, you need to have a kind of no surprises agreement, where if the ROK is going to be talking to the Chinese about the peninsula, it would be nice if we got a briefing ahead of time. Similarly, if we're going to be talking to the Chinese, the United States is going to be talking to the Chinese, it would be nice if we also brief the South Koreans. And I think we can do that. I think we can manage this process. I think it's also important from time to time to go in there and do it together, and to have trilateral meetings. And there will be other times when I think it's also important that the United States' other ally in the region, and perhaps for South Korea, a challenge in the region. But nonetheless, I think we need to look for better ways to have cooperation with Japan on these issues. Japan is obviously a very difficult issue for the ROK today. I must say, it didn't always seem to be the case. I mean, I was in the ROK in the 1980s, and seldom did people talk about Japan in the ROK the way they do now. To some extent, it might reflect the fact that Japan is a little different than it was in the 80s, to be sure. I think, just as I said, that nationalism is something that's affected many countries. It's probably also affected Japan. Certainly, the issue of the disputed rocks, that is the Liancourt rocks, as the Americans would describe them, has been an open sore in the relationship between the ROK and Japan. But I think when you look at that relationship, when you look at the fact that these are two countries that really, whose success each depends on, it would not be helpful to Japan if the ROK economy were weak. It would not be helpful to the ROK if the Japanese economy were weak. Clearly, there's a lot of interaction in the economies. There's certainly some competition, but I would say there's more scope for cooperation even than there is competition. So I think these two countries really need to figure out a better way of dealing with each other. And certainly, as they consider a future without North Korea, they need to consider a future of how to deal with China. I think too often in Japan, there's this kind of zero-sum notion that if China's up, Japan must be down, and if Japan is up, China must be down. Well, that's not the way it's going to work in the future. And I think it is, people need to get away from this kind of zero-sum thinking, and I think that is something that the Japanese need to do a better job of thinking through. Japan needs to be more trusting and understanding that when the ROK has meetings with Japan, they should not see it with China. They should not see it as a ROK-China effort to gang up on Japan, but rather as an effort to deal with some of these residual issues, namely North Korea. So when I look at all these different combinations, whether the U.S. talks to China at one point, or the U.S. and the ROK talk to China, or maybe Japan talks to China, these are all kind of combinations of things that we did in the six-party talks. And so when you look at the legacy of those six-party talks, a legacy that I think many people write off as a failure. After all, North Korea still has nuclear ambitions, despite putting together 5 of the world's leading countries together on the process. People who only look at it in that one dimension, that is in dealing with the North Koreans, really need to stop and think about what kind of patterns of cooperation the six-party talks have created in the region. And when you think about the fact that Japan and China could hardly talk to each other at certain points, but were able to talk to each other in the six-party process, when you look at the maturity and growth of the China ROK discussions, the sophistication of those discussions within the six-party process, a process that was that they were not able to do outside of the six-party talks, you can see that the six-party talks were kind of beginning to offer a kind of proto creation of a multilateral structure. in East Asia. And I think as we look at that, we realize how much we need more of these international structures in East Asia. I submit to you that many of these territorial issues, whether Dakdo or Daitai Islands or Spratly Islands, I submit to you that many of these things are, and I would call them unsolvable in the short run. They're simply not going to be solved to mutual interests in the short run. So what can be done with them? Well, as I said, everyone has these kind of maritime disputes. But if you look at how the Europeans, and it's funny for an American to be extolling the wisdom of the Europeans on this, but the Europeans have done a pretty good job of this, and I think we could all, Americans, Chinese, Koreans, we could all learn a thing or two from the Europeans about how they created structures. People look at Europe now, I mean, if you visit there, you turn on the television and it's one set of motorcades arriving at some meeting building, another set of motorcades leaving, and they're having meetings all the time. You won't go, what is with these people? I mean, the bane of my existence was going to meetings, and they seem to do it for the fun of it. And yet, when you look back in European history and you realize the hideousness of some of that history, the war, the brutality of some of that history, you get an understanding of why the Europeans have invested so heavily in these transnational or multilateral structures. And even though I think Asia has certainly had its bad times and bad centuries, nonetheless, I think these structures can also, I think, be, those difficult times for Asia may not have been akin to, for example, the Holocaust or something, although frankly, when you disaggregate some of the moments in Asian history, you can also see a kind of similar pattern of hideous brutality in the past. I think Asia could benefit more from these kinds of structures. Asia and the United States really could benefit from these structures that the Europeans, I think, have been pretty successful in putting together. So, is there a solution to the Japan-Chinese territorial disputes? Probably not in the short term, but couldn't they send it to some commission for unsolvable disputes and let the commission kind of work on it and report back in a couple of years and come up with some intermediate sort of economic confidence building measures where, say, China and Japan could form a joint company that could exploit whatever fishing rights. Frankly, I think it's all exaggerated, all these economic benefits from these things. But couldn't they do some things like that without foreclosing on the question of the sovereignty of the territory? I think there are a lot of things that can be done, but in order to do those, you need structures. You need to be able to put together structures that people believe in. Now, Asia is not without multilateral structures. Look at ASEAN. It took me a long time to get people in the Bush administration to understand that ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, was actually a very good thing to have. And so Americans, and maybe Koreans are a little like this as well, Americans would say, well, what good does it do? What does it decide? Well, sometimes the purpose of meeting is not to decide anything. It's just to meet and be together and sort of talk to each other and get some understanding of how the other person is looking at this. So I think ASEAN is a good structure to begin with. Obviously, it needs to be more than a talk shop if it's going to be successful. You need to do some more things. I remember when I was ambassador in Poland, and I remember I had an extraordinary time one day. I was up in the North Sea, the Baltic Sea, and they were having an exercise involving the Russian, the U.S., and the Polish militaries. And the exercise was, there was a natural disaster, a so-called natural disaster in an exercise right off of the coast. And so a Russian troop transport was carrying U.S. Marines to help set up a hospital, and there were some so-called victims, and then there were other countries coming in and playing a part in this exercise. So I thought, well, why don't we do that in Asia? Why can't we have set up a hospital, a field hospital, say, on some island in the Philippines? The scenario might be there was an earthquake, and so they set up a hospital, but then you need to cooperate with other countries. It was impossible to get done. And finally, I kept working on it, and 3 years after I started working on this, but 1 year after I left the job, I heard that it was finally successful. I said, you mean they actually set up a little hospital and had Chinese doctors and American doctors? And no, what they did was, in Manila Bay, they had a Philippine helicopter drop a Filipino Marine into the water, and he was picked up by another helicopter belonging to the United States, and they had a Chinese observer. So I said, okay, well, that's a start. But the point is, I think Asia, with respect to these structures, that may have been a start, but Asia needs to pick up the pace. You know, we can do a lot more than that. And certainly, I think the U.S. would be there to be very helpful. We have a fleet that can do a lot of these things. We have a lot of experience in the Partnership for Peace in Europe and with our Eurasian partners there who are not members of NATO but are in this kind of outer family of NATO. I think a lot more could be done in Asia to begin these kinds of patterns of cooperation. I think for China, this is a whole different view of the world. And I think when we are frustrated with China, we need to understand that when a country has a 4,000-year history that doesn't quite jive with what we're trying to get the Chinese to do today, we need to be a little respectful of that 4,000-year history and understand that China does not look at every other state in the region as a kind of Westphalian equal sovereign, but rather they look at many of these states in the region as somehow tributary states. It's a very difficult concept to overcome. And the way to do that is to begin to actually do things like dropping a Chinese Marine in Philippine Bay and have them picked up by a Filipino helicopter or something like that with an American observer, whatever. But there needs to be a much more comprehensive effort at multilateralizing the issues in East Asia. With respect to North Korea, I think when the Chinese kind of understand that that North Korea is really a relic of their past rather than an element of their future. When the Chinese understand, look, we have all had friends when we were 16 years old that we would really rather not see again now. And I think the Chinese need to come to the conclusion that this was a friendship they picked up early on and it's time to move on. I don't want to sound like China's mother in this regard, but I think China needs to understand that North Korea, to somehow be perceived as the only country in the world that is somehow doing business as usual with North Korea, is not something that's acceptable to the rest of us. So I think China can grow to understand that, but I think we, the United States and especially, and the United States and ROK especially, need to convince the Chinese what we're interested in and what we're not interested in. We are not interested in humiliating China over the loss of this ally, North Korea. We're not interested in creating a situation where there are U.S. listening posts on the Yalu River or where U.S. troops would move north of the 38th parallel, thus completing MacArthur's efforts in September 1950. We need to be very clear we're not interested in taking any kind of strategic advantage from this, but we are interested in doing something that is truly one of the great tragedies of, and overcoming this great tragedy of the 20th century, and that is giving the Korean people on the Korean Peninsula the right to decide their own future. Whether Koreans ultimately decide that they want to have 2 Koreas or 5 Koreas, that's up to the Koreans to decide. But we need to create the circumstances where the Korean people are allowed to overcome this terrible legacy of the mid-20th century and decide their own course for the future. I really do believe that the regional dynamics in Northeast Asia can allow for that. I really do believe that we can work much harder, systematically, with a clear vision and with a working compass to deal with the Chinese. I think we need to trim our sails, if I can mix the metaphor, and make clear that we have certain interests with China. And there are certain other things that whatever we say, China's just going to do whatever they do. So I think we need to be very careful to pick some priorities. I would love it if China were just like us. It's not just like us. So I don't think we should be trying to do that, but I think we should really try to convince China that with respect to certain issues of security, such as North Korea's nuclear program, that China needs to understand that we can find win-win solutions on this. I think too often the Chinese think that win-win is the name of some Burmese dissident rather than as a concept that they can somehow work to achieve in international relations. I think the Chinese can be brought around to the idea that a united Korean Peninsula is not a threat to them and indeed provides an opportunity. Ultimately, Northeast Asia has so many, its opportunities are enormous, and yet it has, because of North Korea, been an exporter of crises more than an exporter of anything else. And I think what we need to do is try to work together to contain those crises, to contain this threat of North Korea. If in the meantime we have to thicken up our military readiness, then that's what we'll have to do. But I don't think we have forever to deal with this North Korean nuclear issue. I think we need to be in a position of willingness to talk to the North Koreans, but I think it's quite correct for us to insist that North Koreans talk on the basis of things they've already agreed to, rather than as a country with a sort of collective amnesia that they cannot remember what they agreed to the day before. So I think we need to be really very clear with the North Koreans that they have agreed to give up their nuclear weapons, and we have agreed to put a lot on the table in response to that, to giving up their nuclear weapons, but that we are not going to just talk for talking's sake. So I think the six-party process, which has frankly not met for many years, is still very much alive as a conceivable approach to the problems of dealing with North Korea. I don't think it's so important whether it's a six-party process or a 16-party process. I think what we need to understand is that the six-party process needs to be a multilateral process, a process that that has countries that share a vision for what this region of the world is, and to make sure that the Pacific Ocean that is so large is actually one that joins the United States to this Northeast Asia. It makes us and really realizes the vision of this pivot and makes the United States very much a long-term player in this vital region of the world. So thank you very much.